Now, UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak used the G20 Summit in Bali, Indonesia, to slam Russia. Sunak says its invasion of Ukraine is barbaric. Sunak also appears to be taking a softer stance somewhat on China than the previous administration of Liz Truss, although it was a very short-lived administration, but they were planning to take a different stance. It suggests the updated UK's integrated review may not officially designate China as a threat like Russia after all. Well, to clarify and give us the latest on these issues, I'm joined by our UK correspondent, Olly Barratt. Olly, good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us on today here on eNCA. Can we start first just by talking about what the Prime Minister has had to say, really, around the relations with China and the positioning around that policy-wise? What's come out?
It's very interesting, Dan, because, of course, Rishi Sunak's only been Prime Minister for a couple of weeks, and so this G20 summit gives him a real chance to start setting out what is going to be his foreign policy agenda, much of which we haven't had a huge amount of detail about. And China is one of those key issues. We know that Liz Truss, when she was Prime Minister, was saying that she was going to potentially officially designate China as a threat to the UK. That would be a toughening in the UK position, and certainly diplomatically would have been a much harder line from London towards Beijing. But it looks now like Rishi Sunak is not minded to go quite as far as Liz Truss was going to go. In fact, Rishi Sunak has been describing China at the summit in Indonesia as a systemic challenge. He does acknowledge that Beijing poses a threat economically to the UK, but he isn't seeming to go as far as saying that China itself is a threat to the UK, and he insists that he believes that there can be cooperation with Beijing on a number of issues, and he says he will, if he can, hold discussions with President Xi Jinping at the G20. We, of course, have seen Joe Biden doing that, and other leaders as well. And Rishi Sunak says that he thinks that his position now, which is obviously therefore the UK's position now on China, is quite closely aligned with some of those key allies like the United States, like China, like Australia, for example. So it does look as if Rishi Sunak is going to be taking a slightly softer stance than might have been the case under Liz Truss, trying to reach a position with the Chinese where you can come up with concerns about the relationship and some of the activities carried out by Beijing at home and abroad, but at the same time you can cooperate with them too. Now, that will be controversial, by the way, here at home. Many Conservative MPs think that actually there should be a much tougher stance taken with Beijing. There are others, though, who do believe that it's right to do business with China as much as possible and talk to the Chinese as much as possible over issues like, for example, Taiwan.
And over issues like Russia-Ukraine, because apparently the Prime Minister saying that if you want to solve some of the global problems of today, including Russia's invasion of Ukraine, you have to have some level of dialogue with China in seeking ways to resolve those. And has he been clear or hard in terms of the position that he's taking in terms of Russia regarding Ukraine? Because apparently he's saying that most of today's world problems are largely, have been exacerbated largely after the invasion.
He's been using some very strong language in Indonesia. Yes, he talked about the Russian invasion of Ukraine being barbaric. He talked about it being illegal. And not only is he using language like that, he used that language with Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, in the room. In fact, Downing Street have been tweeting out pictures of Rishi Sunak appearing to really glower at Sergei Lavrov, glare at him while they were in the same room together, while condemning Russian activities in Ukraine. The other thing we're hearing from Downing Street, by the way, is that Number 10 believes that there is now a toughening resolve among other G20 members, some of which haven't been as hardline when it comes to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Now, Downing Street not wanting to go through country by country and list those nations which it believes are coming round to a slightly stronger stance against Russia, but it does believe that that is the direction that some of these discussions in Indonesia are headed. And one of the things we're, of course, all looking out for is a communique, whether we get one from the G20, which does have countries countries signed up to some tougher language when it comes to Russia, for example. As I say, Downing Street insists that it thinks that's the direction we're headed in, but there's still huge division among G20 members about exactly the right stance to take on that issue.
Yeah, and finally, I mean, the economic impact of the Russia-Ukraine war has been felt everywhere, especially around energy prices, which have skyrocketed, not just in Europe, but including here in South Africa and many other countries. We know what stopped Liz Truss's administration was her new economic package. And in terms of being at the G20, I wonder what is the message the Prime Minister is conveying around the economic outlook for the UK.
It's a very clear aim from Rishi Sunak in that regard, Dan. He's admitted in Indonesia that the UK's reputation, he says, has taken a bit of a knock recently, and what he means by that is some of those ways in which markets were spooked by Liz Truss's mini budget, which then had to be very quickly unravelled and her finance minister fired and all of that. And Rishi Sunak therefore is trying in Indonesia to give off the air of a man who is in control of his country's finances. We have an autumn statement coming on Thursday of this week here in London, which will be set out by his finance minister Jeremy Hunt. That's going to contain tax rises, spending cuts. The whole point of it is partly to try and restore the UK's reputation on the international scene, and that's been a key part of some of the conversations he's been having at the G20 with other foreign leaders to try and make sure that the UK, in his view, restores its credibility on the international scene.